Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeology. Uh, Today is going to be the first part of a several part video series on public archaeology and public history. Today, I'm joined by a fellow archaeologist and historian, Kelly Bateman, also known on TikTok and YouTube as Historically ADHD.
Thank you for
Um,
having me.
yeah, you're very welcome. And actually, thank you for coming on. Um, and we are going to talk about a variety of subjects, with the two main subjects being Appalachian history, as that is her specialty, as well as the Lost Cause myth, which is something that she and I both are very well versed in. Uh,
Yeah.
which,
Being in
frankly,
the
I think,
South, you got to be.
yeah, as I say, that exactly stole the words right out of my mouth. So, yes. But then there are going to be other subjects that we'll cover as well, such as a big Keanu in the room, which is a
Yeah.
inside joke that will be revealed soon, and a rather infuriating article from the Atlantic claiming that uh, public history is a danger that specifically public targeted women historians, which is
Yes.
yeah, which is anyways,
It's history.
yes, it is, yes,
Quite literally.
yeah, literally, yes. So anyways, so the first subject we're going to talk about is a subject that has actually become even more important to talk about over the past few days, and that is
Yeah.
Appalachian history, accurate Appalachian history. Um,
Yes.
so now, full disclosure, I do have a very wide array of knowledge on Appalachian history, but mainly as it pertains to Native American history within the Appalachians.
Yes. That's
Uh,
very different than what I particularly do.
yeah, exactly. Yes, historically, Kelly here is much more versed and actually knows way more than I do about Appalachian history. I have a very specifically narrowed focus. Uh,
And my
so
focus is pretty narrow too. It's on Southern Appalachia, but my expertise tends to
yeah,
be in North Carolina and Eastern Tennessee.
yeah, mine focuses on like mainly Western North Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia, because that's where a
Yeah.
lot of
The
yeah.
Cherokee
So
area.
yeah, well, not just the Cherokees. There was also, because Tennessee being such a large state, it also had the Muskogee Creek and the
Yes.
Chickasaw. Sorry, the Choctaw and the Chickasaw. The only tribe I think that didn't encroach on Tennessee was or nation, it was the Seminole, because they were
Yeah.
too far south. And
And
that's
a lot of
also
people don't understand that. I mean, back
yeah,
when the natives first came to Appalachia, it was one of the most biodiverse places. I mean, we have
yeah,
archaeological evidence saying that they had year-round habitations there.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
amazing.
Well, and cities like they, they're, you had Middle Woodland. The Middle Woodland period wouldn't necessarily be cities. That would arguably be more like large towns. Cities is where you would begin to see things like the Etowah Mounds or Okmulgee start to appear. Well, Okmulgee is too far south, but the Etowah Mounds start to appear in southern Appalachia, which was sort of the preeminent political
Yeah.
center.
Yeah.
So and as I said, so real quick, let's cover this. The reason we are saying that it's very important to talk about Appalachian history now is because, unfortunately, over the past few days, Appalachia has been rocked by an unprecedented, precedented disaster. Well, really, and not even just Appalachia, because also like it went all the way up to Ohio and even Atlanta and Augusta and Macon, which are normally too far inland for hurricanes to actually damage, because like
And, and to be
yeah,
honest, Raleigh was hit with, I think it was something like a
yeah,
F5 or F4
yeah,
tornado. Like we were,
yeah,
North Carolina was on the dirty side of the storm,
yeah.
supposedly, and that causes more tornadoes and more high gust winds.
Supposedly, yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
that's what it was supposed to be with us, is we were supposed to be, you know, outside of it, looking at
Yeah.
like up until midnight, like even like up until we went to bed at midnight, it showed that we were outside of the hurricane. It was going to go farther west of us, and then 3 hours later, got woken up by Category 4 hurricane winds and no
Yeah.
power. So that is, yeah.
It was
Anyways,
wild. That I forgot who did it. There was a news conference in North Carolina today that
yeah,
Cooper held, and one of the guys there, Watauga County, I believe. He was talking about that Appalachia now has to accept the fact that we are a part of Hurricane Alley,
Yeah,
and to think about that is insane.
yeah, exactly. Because it like yeah, and it wasn't because the three areas of Appalachia that were hit were northeast Georgia, eastern Tennessee, and western North Carolina, with the two hardest hit being eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina.
And
Northeast
Southwest Virginia
Georgia,
got it a little
oh,
bit.
and
County did
southwest
too.
Virginia. Oh, also in western South Carolina too.
Yes,
Got it
yes.
a little bit, but the two hardest hit of those regions were East Tennessee and western North Carolina.
And Western
Actually
North
had to
Carolina got
do
it a lot. Yeah.
I was actually had to do some work Monday near archaeological work Monday near the Georgia Western North Carolina border, and we were very concerned as we were going up the mountains because it was raining. We're like, oh, please don't have this because in Georgia there are multiple dams that have also been talked about being not up to snuff, such as Carter's Lake and other
Yeah.
major dams, and so we're at Georgia's very much at risk too, um,
Mhm.
unfortunately. And Carter's Lake is near my grandparents' house where I stayed after I evacuated, so that's a concern for a
Yeah.
later date.
Yeah.
But
And I don't think people understand how integral like
yeah,
Appalachia is to the entire world. They're talking about that there's going to be an IV shortage because of the
yeah,
disaster here. And then there's a crystal that like is
yeah,
used in
for
semiconductors
phones.
around the world,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, and not only just that, multiple mines for different other things, timber. Appalachia has a lot of mills in it. I know this
Hmm.
for a fact.
Hmm.
The town I grew up in southern Appalachia and northwest Georgia, has so many carpet mills and textile mills.
Yep.
And so that, similar in western North Carolina and East Tennessee. In fact, I can tell you this for a fact, you don't necessarily tell a difference um, when you go to state to state. The only difference is you start because Northwest Georgia uh, is within Appalachia, but it's not quite as high of an elevation as
Yeah.
East Tennessee, and it's more on the elevation of like Western Tennessee, where it's still within Appalachia, but it's not quite as high. It's as you go
Yeah.
further
Yeah. Yeah.
northeast that it begins rising.
And honestly, I mean, a lot of people feel because like North Carolina, I mean, used to extend all the way through to what is now Tennessee. So it sometimes,
So did
especially in the
South
mountains, it
Carolina.
feels like an
Yeah,
arbitrary border, you know?
yeah, yeah, and so did South Carolina. In
Yeah.
fact,
Yeah.
there used to be one massive Carolina, so which is actually something we can talk about in a second. So,
Yeah.
but one of the reasons we're also talking about this is because a lot of people have been making very ignorant comments about
Mhm.
Appalachia over the past few days, especially saying we deserved it because now this is not. I will say this is not untrue. That there was at one point a bunch of sundown towns within Appalachia, just like any other part of the South. You can't
Uh,
deny that.
The United
However,
States
to
is
say
racist. Hello.
yeah, yeah. However, to say that cities now like Asheville, North Carolina, and things like that that are not only very large and very diverse, but also have very high populations of African Americans, and also are very left-leaning blue cities. To say that those are quote unquote sundown towns is ignorant, and also
Yeah.
it just it it misunderstands the nuance of Appalachia, because
Yeah.
which is something that you and I have talked about a couple of times on social media over the past few days. Is
Yes.
there is a lot of nuance with one of the biggest, I would argue the biggest sort of offender is an individual by the name of Chris Valenti, who sort of got the whole ball rolling,
He
and
did.
a he apparently does have a history degree, from what I understand, a master's, I guess, in a history.
Mhm.
However, I don't like I've never really liked his history content. His history content I mean, I've liked some of his videos, but some of them I have taken great issue with, and I'd always called him out on them. Like
Mhm.
he tried to glorify Bacon's Rebellion, uh, you know, trying to be like, oh, it was the enslaved people working together with indentured servants, and that
Against
happened
the
to some
natives. Yeah.
degree, yeah, to some degree. But as I pointed out to him, it's like it was to massacre the natives because he was angry that the Virginia governor that was um, I don't want to necessarily say friendly, but he was more lenient. He was more sympathetic to Native Americans than, because to say he was completely friendly would be
Untrue.
naive. But yeah, he was definitely
Yeah.
more sympathetic, especially
He
given for the
respected the code of
times.
law, I guess you could
Yeah,
say.
yeah,
You got a
exactly.
treaty, you agree to it.
But also, personality falls into the category where he tries to use a lot that the soldiers following orders trope
Yeah.
where and I understand why he's doing it because his father was a Vietnam veteran, and when his father came back, his father became an avid anti-war protester. And his father would tell him, it's like, don't blame the soldier, blame the politician or whatever. And while that's great on paper,
Yeah.
it ignores the actions of soldiers themselves, because the whole "oh, I was only following orders" has been used throughout history, especially during World War II,
Yeah.
by Japan, Italy, and Germany, not just Germany.
Yeah.
People, unfortunately, Japan and Italy tend to cover their shit up, but it has been used to justify their
Yeah.
actions, and their horrific actions, by saying it wasn't my idea, I just followed orders. And
Yeah.
that's also
Yeah.
been used throughout United States history, especially as pertaining to Native Americans. So
Yeah.
we have a lot of things that are just misconstrued. So, Kelly, why don't you go ahead and we'll start. Why don't you explain some of the nuance of Eastern North Carolina and Appalachian
You mean
things
Western
such as
North
that?
Carolina?
Sorry, Western North Carolina. My apologies.
No worries. It's hard.
Yeah,
It gets mixed up a lot.
yeah.
Well, I mean, to start of it, I mean, you have to think about the way that Appalachia and North Carolina has always been viewed since the time of like the colonies, right? The first time we see any sort of like description of anybody from the back country and what would eventually become Appalachia is William Byrd II, right?
Yeah.
And he basically relates them to being like pigs.
Mhm.
And there seems to be, I mean, I don't know how much of Bacon's rebellion actually plays in it, but there seems to be a very much a fear among sort of the established elite in the colonies that the poor whites and the enslaved people are outnumbering them. And if they do get together, they could overthrow us. And you start seeing more and more of these like seeds of distrust being planted on both sides, right? The whole factor is they want to keep both sides fighting, because if as long as they're fighting, they're not fighting us. And I
Mhm.
think a lot of that still plays in today. I mean, I
It
don't know
does.
how many times it feels like, yes, my skin color absolutely is a privilege. It gets me in the door, it allows me to blend. I'm not denying that. But it really isn't that much, because once they find out who you are and how you speak and how you think,
Yeah.
it becomes a limiting factor. So I kind of feel like this idea of whiteness, we sold out a potential person that could help us get ahead and actually move forward in this country for so little, right? It kind of
Mhm.
feels that way. And it feels awful. And we have to admit our part in that, you know,
Yeah.
we do.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it's time to let go of that. It's time for Appalachians to see each other as friends and common in this area. And if they want change to happen, that's the only way it will.
Mhm. Yeah.
Sorry,
And
I was preaching here.
no, it's okay. That's
You
okay.
could cut it
And
out.
no, you don't. No worries. What was I gonna say? Now I would say I would say maybe Bacon's Rebellion has a lot to do with that. However, I would also say that arguably the Tuscarora and Yamasee Wars had more to do with,
I haven't
because
considered that. That's an interesting
yes,
thought.
well, because so the Tuscarora War, how it began is very interesting. So when England founded first the colony of Carolina, It was not called Carolina first; it was called Carolina, and then
Hmm.
eventually changed into Carolina when it was officially made into a colony. It also
Yes.
originally stretched all the way to the West Coast, so that's an interesting little fact that the
Yeah.
United States technically was Carolina at one point. Um, but when it was officially founded, the British colonists would work with Native American, powerful Native American chiefdoms and nations, such as the Yamasee, the Tuscarora, as well as the Cherokee, the Muskogee Creek, the Choctaw, the Catawba, etc. Um, and what is essentially became the Native American slave trade, where they would exchange prestige goods like firearms, glass beads, and things like that in return for enemy captives from rival nations that were sold to the British and also the Spanish and the French. So essentially what happened is they say the Tuscarora would go and raid the Yamasee and would take uh, take a few captives and then would sell them, or the Tuscarora and the Yamasee would raid all the way down to the Appalachia, where Appalachia gets its name,
Yeah.
um, uh, and would bring all those captives up to British ports, mainly Charleston, and also Jamestown, to sell into the Native American slave trade, where they would be either put in plantations in the Carolinas and Virginia, or would be transported to the Caribbean. The same would be for the French, where they would, be put into French colonies like Louisiana,
Hmm.
or say Quebec and Spain, La Florida, etc. And so what eventually happened is in 1710, I believe. I'd have to look at the exact date, but in 1710, the Tuscarora eventually decided, uh, realized, if you will, that they would eventually become the next targets, and so they gathered a massive uh, alliance of Native American nations and launched an all-out attack on the British colonies of Carolina, and
Hmm.
actually did pretty well. They built fairly well done forts. Archaeologists went and looked at them and realized they were just as well designed as British forts. However, they lacked the ability to, they lacked cannons within them, which wasn't necessarily a deciding factor at first, but then eventually uh, powerful Native American nations such as the Cherokee sided with the British because they were being paid to, and they won the day. In fact, most of the early European quote unquote victories against Native Americans were actually Native American victories against other Native Americans. And
Yeah.
then basically immediately after that, one of the Native American nations who sided with the British, the Yamasee, again realized, hey, we're going to be next. And so they turned right around literally the next year and started the Yamasee War
Yeah.
and allied with the Muskogee Creek and such, and temporarily allied with the Cherokee, and until eventually the Cherokee sort of decided, well, we like being paid more by these people and we're going to
Yeah.
switch sides. And that in other tribes like the Catawba as well, and that eventually won the day because again, most early European quote unquote victories were Native American victories against
Yeah.
Native Americans, and then that eventually led to the abolishment of the Native American slave trade, which was replaced by the African chattel slavery, which had already
Hmm.
existed but didn't really go into full swing and become what it would become until after the Tuscarora and the Yamasee Wars.
Yeah.
So that has a lot to had a lot to do with the fear, at least in the Carolinas and Appalachia. I mean, yes, the Powhatan and other powerful nations like the Susquehannock, but
Hmm.
those were mainly in the Middle Atlantic.
Yeah.
Virginia, um, uh, Delaware, Maryland, etc. Which is I've debated this with other archaeologists, but Virginia is a weird amorphous blob that's not necessarily the southeast, but also isn't necessarily not the southeast. It depends on the region. Yeah,
I've always heard it by other Southerners referred to as the buffer zone.
yeah, you could argue that. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. It's a weird
it's as
buffer.
far
Yeah,
it's as far north as you can get while still being south, and far
yeah.
south as you can get with still being north.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, so that has a lot to do with it, and such. And also, Uh, uh, things like Stono's Rebellion has a lot to do in Carolina,
Yeah.
which and with it
I was getting
bringing
ready to
out
ask you about that, in fact.
yes, which actually had a later factor because trying to think here. So because Stone's Rebellion actually later influenced the fears of a quote unquote servile uprising, which you know very well,
Mhm.
Kelly.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that in the Lost Cause portion of the video because plays very heavily in that.
Mhm.
But they were feared of servile insurrectionists because when enslaved Africans and African Americans would flee enslavement, they would often go to Native American nations like the Cherokee or the Seminole, etc., where they would be often welcomed pretty much with open arms and adopted into the nation.
Mhm.
And so that led a fear that there was going to be some sort of alliance to wipe out and to be fair, not necessarily unfounded, but not completely founded either, because a lot of times they were just trying to get away. Uh,
Yeah.
but that led to a fear, and actually, when the Anglo-Cherokee War broke out during the Seven Years' War,
Mhm.
or the French and Indian War, uh, which was a Cherokee victory. Yes, the British said that they won, but when you actually look at the events that happened, the course of events, no, they didn't.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
well, I've already done a video on this, but long story short, it's they lost more casualties, didn't gain any ground, and even when they burned a few villages on their way back to British territory, they were constantly ambushed and attacked by the Cherokee, and then they got back to British territory and like we won, and it's just sort of
Yeah.
like like you set fire to somebody's notebook and then they beat the crap out of you all the way
Yeah.
outside of the school, outside of school, and they're like, when they get home, I won the fight. It's like, no, you didn't. You
It's kind
burned
of
a
like
single
Cartman,
thing.
right?
Yeah, exactly. Kind of like Cartman. You burnt a single notebook or you burnt a single village. So
Yeah.
yeah, but that has a lot to do with it as well. So there's a lot of Native American history has a lot to do with, had a
Yeah,
lot to
yeah.
do with
I mean,
the
it all does,
fears.
and people tend to think of history as like just being, oh, you're looking at
Yeah,
it only from this one perspective. There's no outside. Couldn't be more true. I mean, the more I learn, the more I realize that it's
yeah.
far more complicated, and I know very little.
The Cherokee American War is another massive factor.
Mhm.
Dragon Canoe in the Cherokee, he made an alliance with the Muskogee Creek, um, the Choctaw, the Shawnee, and the Lenape, also known as the Delaware, and waged a
Mhm.
20-year war against America. And it ended in essentially a draw. Again, America claimed they won, but they gained no territorial gains, and it was just sort of like people punching each other for 20 years and then deciding like we're done, and then
Yeah.
so yeah, a lot of Native American stuff, and of course, Scotch Irish. So Kelly, why don't you explain what Scotch Irish,
Well, so yeah.
which I know is a term that doesn't necessarily exist, but it also does. It's a weird
It does exist.
definition.
It's more of an American colloquial thing, and I try to
Yeah,
warn people about it because I didn't know when I went over to Ireland and I accidentally
yeah.
said it, and it was very embarrassing. They were like, "Explain that term to me." So I try to warn other Americans just in case they're ever like around other
Okay.
people that that's not a thing to them.
Oh, I
So
know it's not.
I typically refer to them as the Lowland Scots, or
And that's
as I
fair.
corrected, the Ulster Scots.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, they're pretty interesting people because, as you know from studying history and archaeology, anytime any group is in a border region that is contested, they are always going to be maligned, attacked by both sides. It's really hard to thrive when you're
Mhm.
constantly worrying about, well, who's going to take me over next?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the story of the Lowland Scots because they're right at the at Hadrian's Wall, right? And
Mm.
I think we discussed it a couple months ago about some archaeology that was being done there, showing that the
Yeah.
Lowland Scots were actually playing off of both sides,
Yeah.
which makes sense. Honestly, I think if your home is constantly being raided and some guy keeps coming, showing up and telling you, "Oh, I'm your king," or "I'm your king," and
Mhm.
they're killing you
Yeah.
anyway, who cares? They're not on your side. And I kind of feel like that is sort of where that Appalachian distrust of government sort
Yeah.
of like first. You first see the signs of it. Eventually, the Lowland Scots are, I don't know whose idea it was transferred over from Scotland and put into Ireland to try to, I guess, deal with the Irish. And
Yeah.
that went over extremely well. It's not like they're still dealing with the fallout from that or anything like that, right?
Yeah.
And then the Lowland Scots, they're the Ulster Scots, they run into trouble too because they're stuck between two conflicts, right? They're supposed
Yeah.
to be slightly better than the Irish, and the Irish hate them, and they end up causing trouble and end up being sent to the United States as prisoners. And that's pretty much how my family comes here. They were sent to, one of them was sent to the Georgia colony, penal colony.
Yeah.
That was as far back as I could get.
Oh wow. Yeah. Yeah. And also, to add on to that, so were French Huguenots and
Yes,
Germans,
yes.
because several of the penal colonists in the colony of Georgia were German. Um,
Yeah, I have a question about that because I don't know as much about Georgia. You might know the answer to it. I
uh,
know that the Moravians first tried to settle in Georgia. Is that correct?
well, okay, so first the Moravians settled up north. So
Hmm.
when they came to Georgia, it was they'd been making inquiries, but essentially it was at the request of Cherokee leadership, specifically individuals such as James Van,
Hmm.
who invited them to come to Georgia to set up mission schools to begin teaching. Um, it's not necessarily so. That's one set of Germans who came to specifically North Georgia, and they built
Yeah.
things like the Spring Place Mission School in Chatsworth, Georgia, which is very near the Tennessee and Georgia and North Carolina border with Georgia.
Hmm.
But then there was also the Germans who were penal colonists at the colony of Georgia. In
Yeah.
fact, the part of the reason that so in Georgia in the the 1730s. So for one thing, part of the reason Georgia was founded was as a buffer colony between the Carolinas and Spanish Florida.
Yeah.
George James Oglethorpe was a general, so he did have soldiers there, uh, and so at one point in time he did
I need
try to
to
invade some.
pause for just a second. My kid's
Uh,
screaming. Hold on one
that's
second. I'll
fine.
be right back.
That's fine. Yeah. Second. Or
Yeah.
uh, Okay, yeah. So, anyways, to continue where we were, so in the 1730s, James Oglethorpe attempted to invade Spanish Florida, and he
Hmm.
laid siege to St. Augustine. Did not go well. He eventually retreated back to Georgia, and then Spain did the exact same thing, and then only opposite went to invade British Georgia. This time, it basically the same thing happened. It did not go well for the Spanish as they were trying to sneak up on Fort Frederica, the main fort of the Georgia colony. Scouts spotted the Spanish forces, briefly skirmished with them. Someone went back and got James Oglethorpe, and he brought with him Germans and Scottish Highlanders,
Yeah.
as well as Yamacraw, the Yamacraw faction of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and their warriors, and essentially because the inexperienced British militia did not necessarily fare that well, so he
Hmm.
brought these guys who were more experienced in, like
Makes
getting up
sense.
close, because Germany was one not unified, and so was oftentimes at war with each other, and Scotland had a lot of warriors then, and so did the Muskogee Creek, and so they just charged into the Spanish lines and drove them back and battled them a few other times, and then drove them out of Georgia.
Yeah.
So, so yeah, it's like yeah, so but that's where the Germans come from. In a lot of Germans, not all Germans, but a lot of Germans
Yeah.
come from in Georgia, and also
I
some
just asked because
Scots.
like I'm like not far away from Old Salem. So
Yeah, yeah,
and
exactly.
they
Yeah,
eventually come over here, and they're really interesting because they start off being very much abolitionists.
yeah.
And
Oh,
thankfully,
yeah,
old Salem's actually doing a really great job of this. They had this little like example, and what they would do is they would ask God if they should have a slave or not. And if they pulled out the paper and it said yes, that meant God said it was okay. And now they're starting to finally like discuss and investigate what enslavement was like in Salem, which is really cool.
That's good. That's good. And
Yeah.
because I know at the James Van House, which is literally just maybe a block away from where Spring Place Mission used to be, there's a plaque there. It no longer exists. I know the both the site manager and the interpretive ranger personally for that
Mhm.
site. And they actually discuss that in their
Great.
tours, as well as they have a dedicated display, like a little mini display museum, to talk about the experiences of enslaved individuals. Because despite originally having a camaraderie, even up until the War of 1812, eventually the five most powerful Native American nations of the Southeast, with the exception of the Seminole, for the
Mhm.
most part, they did it a little bit, but not quite as much. And there's also some debate. You could be argued how much of that is they did enslave, and how much of it is Europeans claiming they did and not understanding their culture.
Yeah.
But that's a whole nother bag of animals. But at least the Cherokee, the Muscogee Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw most certainly did practice African chattel slavery,
Mhm.
and they were every bit as brutal to their enslaved Africans and African Americans as white American enslavers were. This
Yeah.
does not, of course, does not justify the genocide perpetrated against them. However, it also does not the genocide does not justify their treatment of of
Yeah.
enslaved individuals.
Can I
So
just say something real quick? Like
uh,
just me and you could take it out or whatever. I don't care. It's so infuriating to me, like that people in the past have to be all good or all evil.
no, that's perfectly, yeah, exactly,
They're
yeah.
complicated. Societies are complicated. There's different groups of people,
Mhm.
and that's why I think bringing it back to Appalachia, I think it's so important we discuss the history of Appalachia because
Yeah,
everybody sees what was
yeah,
done. When you think of Appalachia, when you think of mountain people, you think white, you think of the Beverly Hillbillies, the Dukes of Hazzard,
yeah,
and that doesn't even
exactly.
begin to encompass Appalachia. I mean, because number one, there is absolutely no Native Americans on any of those shows or discussed.
Nope,
There's no Black
no,
people. There's no Hispanic people, and
yeah,
they have been there. You know?
yeah, exactly. Well, like during the like during the Cherokee American War, there were a lot of British Tories who fought on the side of the Cherokee, uh,
Mhm.
who of Dragon Canoe's faction of Cherokee. Because it's also important to note that the part of the Cherokee Nation, which was actually led by Dragon Canoe's father, was and also Nancy Ward, a very well-known Cherokee.
Mhm.
Uh, uh, Trying to think of a most beloved woman, which was a specific rank in Cherokee culture. Um, they were a neutral faction who did not war with the United States.
Yeah.
So it's also interesting to think in an alternate world, if they had sided with Dragon Canoe, they probably could have won. And I mean this literally, because George Washington was terrified of the Native American nations allying with each other. He wrote at length talking about how formidable
Of
the Cherokee and the
course.
Muscogee Creek were. He said they had 5,000 warriors. To put this in perspective, at the time he was president, the United States had between 1,000 and 2,000 soldiers, period.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was their entire military. So he's just like, let us not piss these people off.
And and
Same
and
with
and the way they
Jefferson.
fought is brilliant. I mean,
Yeah,
they knew the
yeah,
landscape. This was their home field. They were doing
yeah,
guerrilla warfare for British
yeah,
soldiers who were sitting
exactly.
there lining up and firing.
Well, and to be fair, that wasn't necessarily a bad tactic because of the inaccuracy of muskets before rifling. So that was actually the way to do it. And even
Oh yeah.
when British people like, say, Francis Marion from the Carolinas
Yeah.
did guerrilla warfare, they would pop out and do line warfare. So it's a little more complicated on that regard, but
Yeah. If of course it is. It's just that I
yeah,
always find it interesting, like the fact that he feared them so much and he eventually
yeah,
tries some of their tactics.
yeah, exactly. Well, and that was well, and Jefferson was the same way. Thomas Jefferson, who also was the person who came up with the idea of Indian removal, he never actually enacted it, but it was his idea. It was his brainchild, very much. Um, Even he was scared of multiple Native American nations, the Cherokee, the Muskogee Creek, and the Osage, which is not in Appalachia, but that's an interesting thing where he said that they were essentially like we're about to be going on the Great Plains. Let's not piss these people off. Boy, they are very powerful, but
Yeah.
very similar ideas. But yeah, Appalachia was very diverse. I mean, it had uh, Highland and Lowland Scots. It had
Yep.
Germans. It had both free and escaped enslaved African Americans, as
Hmm.
well as Native American nations. And they would often work together and, yes, often fight amongst each other. But it's
Of
important to
course.
note they would intermarry and work together often. And I think now this also brings us to Appalachia's one of Appalachia's two original sins. Of course, one being chattel slavery, but the other one being the removal of the Native Americans from Appalachia.
Yeah.
Um, and that's not necessarily so cut and dry either, because
No,
yes, a lot
it
of Appalachians like Andrew Jackson, who I'm related to, unfortunately.
oh,
Um,
really.
yeah,
I liked him until I found out like all this, like I like hate him, I like to hate him until I
yeah,
found out all the cool sayings I thought he said he never did. So I was like, oh no, I just hate him. Never
yeah.
mind.
Well, and he also okay. So here's the thing that's a little bit of a tangent. So he often he built his career off of his military record. Now I do want to say he was a major general. You don't become a major general without being having some skill in warfare and such. However, his victories in the Creek War, the First Creek War, as well as in the War of 1812, were often victories that were won thanks to his Native American soldiers. Like,
Yeah.
for example, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend.
Mhm.
He tried to demolish the fort with cannons, and it didn't work. The fort stood, and it wasn't until Cherokee 500 Cherokee and several Muskogee Creek and Choctaw, sorry, not Muskogee Creek, several Choctaw um, and Chickasaw went behind the fort, and one of them swam across and started like ferrying canoes across, like pulling canoes across so the warriors could cross. And once they crossed and got into the fort and caused enough chaos in the fort, that's when Andrew Jackson could charge in. So there's
Yeah.
that. And then, of course, also the Battle of New Orleans was won, one because of the help of the Choctaw who were there, but also because the French pirate Jean Lafitte provided cannon fire that
Yeah.
caused a brutal. So a lot of his main victories were not actually of his own making. And to be fair, with the Battle of New Orleans, he didn't actually claim that it was like his Tennessee militia. They claimed that, but
Yeah.
he then later capitalized on it. But yeah,
Yeah.
so that's a little tangent. But yeah, so a lot of Appalachians like Andrew Jackson did support Indian removal, quote unquote Indian removal. Um, but a lot of them didn't.
Yeah.
One, Andrew Jackson's main political opponent at the time, Henry Clay, was very
Yes.
much against Indian removal.
Mhm.
Also, Sam Houston from Tennessee was against Indian removal. He had also been adopted into the Cherokee Nation at a young age. Um, so he very much was a lifetime ally to Native Americans, not even just Cherokee.
Yeah.
And then also Davy Crockett, or David Crockett as he preferred, who was a massive opponent to to Andrew Jackson. They hated
Yeah.
each other, and that's partly because Andrew Jackson portrayed himself as a man of the people. I'm a one of the common people, one of the common man, while also
Yeah.
being a wealthy plantation owner.
Yeah.
Whereas David Crockett had lived in poverty till his dying day, and was actually a man of the people. So,
And
so
and also you're forgetting how like within the own Appalachian community that people were friends with natives. They
yeah,
intermarried, like you said, and so
exactly.
there were
Yeah.
European descendants helping hide
Hmm.
Native Americans,
Yes.
and
the
because they were
Moravians,
family, right? And then
yeah.
and plus, I mean, the Cherokee knew those lands better than probably anybody, and
Mhm.
some were able to hide on their own, and
Yes. Well,
thank God
and
they did.
a funny thing with that too, because that's because there's another thing that I only found out recently. So uh, there was, the Cherokee who hid during Indian rule in North Carolina, but there was also a group of Cherokee who actually approached a white Appalachian congressman in North Carolina who helped them win a legal battle to become
Really?
citizens of North Carolina,
That's cool. I didn't
and
know
make sure
that.
that it's like in my research for the Cherokee video, my video on Cherokee Indian removal, I found that I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. But that's a
Yeah,
good
yeah.
example. But yeah, but Henry Clay, Sam Houston, Davy Crockett, they gave impassioned speeches in the House of Representatives and Senate against Indian removal, and actually the vote was like incredibly close, like uh 121 to like 119, etc. Like they like
Yeah.
19 to 20 to 19 or something like that, like very close. Like it was by no means a universally accepted. And then also, uh, you had people like the Moravian missionaries who were
Yeah.
against it. The biggest proponent in the Appalachia for Indian removal was actually the state of Georgia. The state of Georgia wanted gold in Dahlonega, which was part of the Cherokee Nation, and they pushed a lot of legislation through,
Yeah.
which is unfortunate. So yeah, Appalachia is so diverse, and it's just like to encompass all of that history into racism, Confederacy is like
And like and that's the thing that gets me really upset. And
mhm. Yeah,
I actually descended from Southern Unionists. My family
yeah,
in Eastern Tennessee is known at the time as a Union holdout, uh,
yeah,
because a lot of them felt loyalty to the Union due to what happened in Kings Mountain, and some wealthy Appalachians who actually did own slaves. I think one of the men, I think they said that he was like the richest man, owned 8 slaves,
mhm,
which is 8 too many, but
yeah,
not quite like what you see in the rest of the South. And they felt like the Union would let them keep their slaves, which, funny enough, they would. And
mhm,
so when you discuss this part of Appalachian history, when you go outside of Appalachia and you go to like the deep south of like Louisiana or Mississippi, and you talk to anybody around there, they do not see Southern Appalachia as Southern because of that. And they still hold it against us and very
mhm.
much see us as traitors. I never felt so unwelcome
Yeah,
in my
yeah,
life. It's insane. And a lot of people don't know this because they think the South is a monolith and
no.
that everybody was for it, but they weren't. There were huge pockets throughout the South that were Union strongholds.
One of my favorite to bring up is the Free State of Jones.
Yeah,
That was a
yeah.
prime example of one. Which, by the way, anyone watching, that's an excellent movie. And every historian I've talked to who specializes in that time period said that essentially it's almost 100% accurate. So
Really, that's
that's
great. That's
yeah,
great.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Well,
So I would
I joke
yeah,
that's why Tennessee's the volunteer state because
yeah,
the East Tennessee men volunteered. I mean, and they literally
yeah,
rode those mountains, which you guys are seeing
yeah,
now, in the middle of the night, leaving their family behind in enemy territory to go
yeah,
to Kentucky and volunteer to. They
yeah,
didn't have to.
yeah,
They weren't asked to. They just did it. And
yeah,
my ancestor was one of the first to volunteer and sign up.
yeah.
And I feel like a lot more Appalachians, if they knew that history, could feel that sense of pride instead of clinging to that false sense of the Confederacy.
Yeah,
You know?
because there is definitely, I mean, for example, there's Chickamauga, the Chickamauga battlefield, which is within
Yes.
Appalachia, which also
Hmm.
has a lot of weird like cryptid like stuff connected to it for whatever fucking reason, like
Yeah.
something about a green-eyed monster, which is like okay, what? Yeah, I don't know, it's
Yeah.
weird, yeah,
I
but
mean,
also
no, I
like
mean,
yeah,
I think I'm not 100% sure. It's either at that battle or the battle just before my ancestor was taken and held as a POW.
Oh
in
shit. Yeah.
Virginia. So, yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. Well, and then yeah, and then where I lived, grew up, there was the battlefield was there was a battlefield known as the Battle of Resaca, which was one of the battles that Sherman fought in his march to the sea,
Hmm.
coming down through there. Also, funnily enough, my dad and my grandmother, my dad's mom, who lived in Chattooga County in way northwest Georgia, on right about on the Tennessee Georgia border. Supposedly their house, the site where their house is at, was one of the campsites of Sherman's men as they were marching down. Again, that's speculation. We've been told that,
Yeah.
but
You see,
and my dad, I know, will watch this and he'll probably correct me on this. That but yeah, it's like
yeah.
that's fun. It's still funny. Like, but yeah, he like Appalachia is like deeply connected to that as well because
Yeah.
Sherman marched through Appalachia to eventually get to Atlanta.
It makes me so mad because, like, if my ancestor hadn't gotten captured, I mean, obviously they could have gotten killed and that would have been a different
Yeah,
story. But the First Tennessee Cavalry eventually ends up going with Sherman and going down
yeah,
there. I'm like, what?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
you know, uh, now there is also a pretty big stain on the Southern Appalachia, unfortunately, because he
Yep.
was from there. Nathan fucking Bedford Forrest,
I
who
hate that guy
is
so much.
yeah, yeah, but yeah,
Yeah.
he's definitely there. Well, he's all over the South, but he was from Tennessee, and also he rode he like led some battles in Georgia too. There's unfortunately a such a disappointing story from one of my college professors where he was
Mhm.
talking about how he worked in this museum in Rome, Georgia, um, uh, which is very much in Appalachia, but in Rome, Georgia, where he was just leading them through, and he was pointing to like this guy who's like known as like the sort of the Paul Revere of Georgia, like he rode his horse
Mhm.
to warn people the Union were coming or something like that. But this kid, there's a family with like a couple with a kid, and this kid ran past him, ran past that picture and pointed to a picture of Nathan Bedford Forrest, and like, look, mom, pa, it's a General Forrest, and he's just like, there's only one way that kid could have known what that,
Yeah,
or mom and dad
exactly.
is say. I said mom, pop, probably it was more mom and dad, but you get the idea,
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and
This is
that's
what happens when we don't
yeah,
teach our own. I mean, this is a part of the lost cause, right?
yeah,
This
exactly, and
is
it's yeah. Well, and then another big part of Appalachian history that people often overlook is that like Appalachia is where a lot of unions began to first arise. Um,
yes.
it's not necessarily the only place. There were places out west that were brutally put down by the Pinkertons and other similar
Hmm. Hmm.
companies, which the Pinkertons still exist, people. So have fun with that
Yeah.
knowledge that that they still exist. But yeah, that they
Yeah.
brutally put down. But still, Appalachia has a lot of history with unions. It's there.
Absolutely.
They're part of a very big reason as to why unions eventually arose and why we got better wages, better working conditions, etc. And a lot of
Actually,
it had. Oh, you go ahead. Sorry.
well, there's a North Carolinian. I can't remember her name to save my life. I did a thing on her, and I'm just terrible with names, and it's late. My medicine's gone. But
That's fine.
she actually was killed because of
Yeah.
her work with unions,
Yeah.
because she did something unspeakable. She thought, well, if we got a strike and we want better wages, in order for us all to win, we need to reach across the color line. And she did. And she like walked over and sat with them and talked with them. And it was like, this is for
Yeah.
all of us. And then,
Yeah.
suspiciously, her car is pulled over and she's the only one shot to death. I mean,
Yeah. I'm sure.
so
Yeah.
there is a
Yeah.
strong union history here,
Yeah.
despite what North Carolina tries to teach us.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's like North Carolina has all in North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Western South Carolina, you know, they've West Virginia definitely,
Mhm.
Kentucky, like they have a steep history of resisting against government authority, trying to get better conditions. And even part of that goes into like the Prohibition era. Part of the reason,
Yeah.
like moonshining was a thing was, protest against, in a lot of ways against what was felt to be unjust laws against,
Yeah.
which is, and we're seeing that technically again in the drug war, which is failing just as
Yeah.
spectacularly as
Mhm.
the
Well,
prohibition ever did. So
well, if you ain't got much, you tend to barter,
yeah,
and corn liquor was something that you
yeah,
could. I mean, it didn't getting corn off the mountain wood is extremely hard, but if you ferment it and you bottle it,
mhm,
it's a lot easier. It turns out you can make a lot more money. So
yeah,
it was literally eating to the into the only thing that Appalachians had to make any sort of material purchases.
yeah,
Like Appalachians tend to grow their own food and have their own livestock. So they're fine there. It's the other items that they can't grow or
yeah,
make on their own that they need. And so
yeah,
that's where corn liquor would be
yeah,
substituted.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And so it's just it's Appalachia is such a interesting and diverse region, and really so is any other region in the United States. But like Appalachia, like you hear less about the history of Appalachia than say you do, for example, um, Cajun culture in New Orleans,
Yeah.
or say Quaker or Amish culture in New England in the Mid Atlantic states in the
Yeah.
the Great Lakes region. Uh, it's it's
Well,
an important part of our history.
the
I
media,
mean,
the media, and I want to mean movies, TV, and everything like that.
yeah,
When they look for a safe punching bag, we are
yeah,
always there.
yeah,
And I want to say this real quick. I'm not against like the hillbilly humor, like
no,
Trey
yeah,
Crowder and all them, because it's done with love. The thing that upsets me is when like JD Vance, he sells out
yeah,
his entire
yeah,
story and who he is for money, power, and fame. You laugh at us, please. We don't mind it, but it needs to be done with kindness, not
or yeah. Another good example,
maliciousness.
yeah, another good example that was brought up to me actually earlier today in a comment. Kid Rock, Kid Rock's another prime example of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, you
Yeah,
know,
the faux
yeah,
faux
yeah,
pork.
exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. And then sort of the last thing I do want to bring up about Appalachia is, and this has both good and bad connotations to it. Uh, Appalachia was the first frontier. It was the beginning of westward expansion, and it is the reason why Tennessee uh, and Kentucky and such, part of northern Alabama and northern Mississippi
Mhm.
eventually became states, is because of that expansion. And yes, a lot of that had a lot to do with trying to get the Native Americans out of there, but also a lot of it had to do with intermarrying with Native Americans
Yeah,
and
yeah. I actually have a
escaping.
question for you,
Uh
if
huh.
you don't mind. I
Yeah.
want to hear your take on this. So,
Uh huh.
in doing my research on Appalachia for a long time, double checked this just to make sure it's still up to date. Uh, the first establishment the Ulster Scots have in um, what becomes Tennessee, they wrote to the state of North Carolina, the colony, and said, "We would like this land." They were like, "That's not
Yeah.
our land, so we're not going to help you. You're on your own."
Yeah.
And they were like, "Okay." Now, the story goes is that they went and approached the natives in the area, or at least one group of them, and they paid for the land. I think it was like a 9-year lease. But because of the way the dynamics work within Native communities, that agreement, because it's not like the way we see it in English law, didn't really stand for all others. And then they were attacked.
Yeah.
Now, is how much of that is like legend and how much of that is like
Oh,
true?
well, for one thing, so Daniel Boone, I'm assuming.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So part of it has to do with, so Daniel Boone was a Scotch Irish, was a lowland Scotch descent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Daniel Boone led a lot of lowland Scots into what is now Kentucky, Tennessee, and part of Northwest Georgia. Uh, and he negotiated with forget his partner. He had a partner who negotiated with him, but they negotiated with a branch of the Cherokee
Mhm.
for a huge tract of land that would eventually become known as, and I'm not making this up. It's hilarious that it was called this, but it's what it's called, the Transylvania Purchase.
Ah,
So
yes.
so that had
Okay.
has a lot to do with that, and that's actually the catalyst that led to Dragon Canoe um, starting the Cherokee American War. Because so part of it was when the Proclamation of 1763 was made at the end of the Seven Years' War, which was the British government saying, uh, British colonists can't settle west of the Appalachian Mountains because that's Native American land. Of course, they had no way of really enforcing that, but
Yeah, no one
at
does.
least they tried. Uh, and oftentimes you'll see like a map of like a line, a boundary that is the Proclamation of 1763. That's not, it was never actually a real line. It was a lot more amorphous. But
Because it turns out it's not, it's really hard to be accurate without satellites and
Yeah,
being pointer.
exactly. And also it's hard to enforce a massive empire and say and tell people way across the ocean don't settle here,
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so of course Daniel Boone and other people were like, whatever, we're gonna do it anyway. Uh and so Dragon Canoe was angry at the was not it was angry at the British, but it was more angry at his father and Cherokee leadership for
Mhm.
signing it. He um according to oral history, said, "Hey, this is a terrible idea. We've seen what happens to other Native American nations like the Lenape, the Delaware. We shouldn't do this." But then he capitulated, and then sure enough, his fears happened because it was one of those things like, "Hey, they're not going to just stop with this. They're going to start taking more and more land."
Yeah.
And sure enough, more and more hunting land of the Cherokees was encroached upon. And so he's like, "All right, all bets are off." And so he gathered a bunch of warriors and made alliances with other Native American nations and started a massive war. So
And
over it.
it's sad because that's what eventually like causes North Carolina
Yeah.
to expand further over, right?
Uh, yeah. And also, there was also the Free State of Franklin, which is in what is now Eastern Tennessee.
Yeah.
But it was not Tennessee at the time, and it was actually David Crockett's father was a proponent of that. And
I
of course,
know.
eventually that got incorporated into into not Georgia, into the state of Tennessee.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, it's like it's a very complex thing. But yeah, originally North Carolina and South Carolina were further west, and so was Georgia. Originally,
Yeah.
Georgia encompassed not just what is Georgia now, but also Mississippi and Alabama.
Yeah.
And then they were eventually like negotiated, and it was divided into two different territories, and then three, and it was just a whole
Yeah. It's
land
crazy
rights are
like
weird.
when you start looking at like how the map sort of grows.
Yeah,
It's insane. The thing that I would want to let people know is
yeah,
yes, we're not perfect. European Appalachians are far from perfect.
yeah.
We have done things, we have said things we shouldn't have. Looking back on it now, I wish we hadn't. Um,
Mhm.
but it's an incredibly complex thing because it's always the poor that get used to sort of
Yeah,
like push these expansions forward.
yeah.
And I just want to see Appalachia not be used as a political pawn anymore because it
I
very
completely
much is
agree.
still today. And I
I
think that's why we're
completely
seeing a
agree.
lot of the rhetoric.
Yeah, I completely agree. And actually, you know what? That leads us into our next section because part of
Okay.
the way Appalachia became a political pawn is because of the Lost Cause,
Yeah.
which, so we'll get this right off the bat. It's something that Kelly and I have both said at length, something that other historians have said at length on YouTube. There's a great there's a great YouTuber with a history background called Autun Shea, who's done a series of videos called Checkmate Lincolnites, where he argues literally with himself. One persona is a Union soldier, and one persona
Yeah,
is a
I've seen that.
Confederate
Yeah, he's
soldier. Yeah,
hilarious.
and he debunks the lost cause point by point
Yeah.
with primary sources. But so yeah, the American Civil War was most certainly fought over slavery. Period. Full
Yes.
stop.
Yes.
And another thing I want to say right off the bat, I get so tired of people bringing up that one fucking letter from Lincoln to that I forget that I think it was Henry Clay that he was writing or some other politician where he's saying, "Oh, if I could, keep slavery, yada yada yada, I would. If I could abolish it and to end the war, I would." And he was basically saying he had no position on
Yeah.
slavery. That was a single letter and is contradicted by his earlier speeches and letters where he was talking about abolishing uh, uh, African chattel slavery, and other speeches and letters literally weeks after, like days after, that he gave that were also saying let's abolish it. So it's like it's a single letter that he wrote to one
Yeah.
person that he was trying to uh, essentially calm the person down, and it backfired.
But I
So
mean, honestly, in some ways, I mean, haven't we all like at one point being
yeah,
like, I can imagine being overwhelmed and like all that
yeah,
death and stuff, right? And
yeah,
at some point, I'm sure he did really feel that way
yeah,
because it must have felt
yeah,
like, I mean, it's easy for us to morning quarterback, but as we see right here in the midst of this disaster going on, it's really hard to know what the right decision is to do. And you lose faith sometimes, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly,
it could have been any
exactly,
of that. And
yeah,
we're
yeah,
all human. I just think that we
yeah,
tend to like see historic people as so far and so removed from us. And I
yeah.
think it allows us to excuse their sins, but it
Mhm.
also doesn't let us see growth or
Yeah,
change over time.
yeah, exactly. And so, and also an important thing to point out is there are multiple primary documents talking about the Civil War being fought over slavery. Yes, there was, for one thing, the Articles of Secession of most of the Southern states. Not all of the Southern states had Articles of Secession, but most of them did. And all of those ones that had Articles of Secession made it very clear why they were seceding, and they were also the states that were seceding first, which included
Mhm.
South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia,
North Carolina
Florida.
did not seed
Oh,
first.
oh, I'm sorry, I apologize.
It's
Uh,
okay, no worries.
yeah, so
We're
but
like one of the
South,
last.
yeah, sorry, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas were like the first ones who,
Yeah, and I
you
think it
know,
goes Tennessee,
and
Virginia, North
then
Carolina. Because
yeah,
we only
yeah,
joined the war when Lincoln's like, hey, we need you to help us out. And we're like, we wanted to stay neutral.
yeah, exactly, yeah, exactly. But not even just those. We have speeches from generals like General Longstreet, who
Hmm.
gave a very famous speech where he basically invoked servile insurrection, stating that, hey, Confederates, they're gonna free the slaves, they're gonna free your enslaved people,
Hmm.
enslaved African Americans, and then those free African Americans are now gonna rise up and kill us all.
Yeah.
And that's he invoked that, and that's literally, we don't even need to go into any more definition of what servile insurrection is. That's literally what it was. It's the fear that African Americans would rise up and slaughter all the white people, which of course,
Yeah.
okay, I don't want to say is unfounded because there were events like Nat Turner's Rebellion that
Yeah.
definitely fed into the fears,
I
but
mean,
they
and
were, yeah.
be fair, their treatment, who would have blamed them if they did it?
Exactly,
You know?
exactly, exactly, and that's or and Stone's Rebellion, and that's
Yeah.
another big thing about, like, say, Nat Turner's Rebellion is the treatment of enslaved African Americans is what led Nat Turner and his rebels to
Yeah.
attack white Americans indiscriminately, including women and children, because people don't realize women and children were just as brutal to,
Yes.
like, white women were especially brutal to African enslaved African American women, where they would,
Mhm.
because their husbands would often use
Play with them.
them for, yeah, play with them. But we'll just call it what it is. They would sexually assault them,
Yeah, they
uh,
would rape them. Yeah.
often, rape them, yeah, often, and not care. And so that would often enrage the wives of the enslavers, who, instead of taking their anger out on their husbands, would just take it out on their women. And no, this does not mean that they were necessarily afraid of their husbands. Yeah, I'm sure some of them were, but
Hmm.
a lot of Southern women were very much capable of handling their own, and were oftentimes the people in charge of the household in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
so looking at you, Martha Washington.
Yeah.
Like, that's a prime example.
Julia
But
Grant.
yeah,
Anyway,
yeah, exactly. So, and children too, white children would brutally mistreat
they were taught
African
to do that.
American children. Yeah, they were taught to do that. So it's understandable why that would happen. So yeah,
Mhm.
Nat Turner's rebellion did feed into that. But it wasn't even just that. It was also the economic importance of chattel slavery. Multiple, it was their way of life, and there are multiple journal documents from Confederate soldiers, from ranging from private to colonel, who would often talk about that the reason the Civil War was fought was because they wanted to defend the institution of slavery because it was their way of life. And even afterwards, when the Lost Cause was being constructed, uh, former Confederate generals and colonels like Joe Shelby and others would state that, like one Confederate colonel said, he's like, I've heard about this thing that where they're saying that it was fought over states, right? He's like, I knew of no other reason we fought the war other than to defend slavery.
Yeah.
It directly in the letter is a very short letter. And then General Joe Shelby, who actually had an epiphany and changed his mind later in life because
Really?
he participated in Bloody Kansas
Uh-huh.
in the 1850s, fighting against John Brown, and later in his life in the 1880s, he stated that John Brown was right, and that John Brown, was the one in the right. Essentially, he said we
Yeah.
went out there to defend our way of life. John Brown was right, so he had seemed to have had a change of heart.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so all of that is in dispute. But what not a lot of people know is how the Lost Cause was constructed, which is actually something that I'm a little shaky on, which is why part of the reason why Kelly is here, because she has actually been studying that in length for a while now. So explain
Yeah.
to us how the Lost Cause got constructed into the South.
So, been doing a lot of reading on that. Yeah, I mean, honestly, it goes back to the women, right? These rich and powerful women wanted to control the narrative of how their husbands and were being seen. They didn't want their legacy to be tied up with something so disgusting as slavery. And plus, there was a need to sort of keep the quote unquote natural order in place. And that was that there was this caste system, which is sort of the role that Appalachia plays, where people of color are on the very bottom, but just above them is the poor whites, the poor Appalachians, and then you have the middle class and so on forth, and the plantation on very top, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in order to keep that in, they needed to somehow sort of like sanctify what happened, make it, they needed to like weaponize it. And that is absolutely what these women did. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the Daughters of the Confederacy is like, the more I read about them, the more it is absolutely heinous what they did. And they did good things too, right? They did provide a lot of care for Confederate widows and children. I respect that. But it doesn't even compare to the amount of evil they did, because they helped write the textbooks that are being taught in the schools. They are taking control and building monuments and disconnecting the dead from slavery, and instead clicking it into the Patriot myth, right?
Yeah.
And it just sort of evolves, and everything kind of goes into this culture, this like cult
Mm-hmm.
of the last fight of freedom, right? And so they end up basing all these laws, and all these things are able to get to place because it helps keep the quote unquote natural order in.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make any sense?
That makes a lot of sense, and I assume that had a lot to do with the failure of Reconstruction, the withdrawing of Reconstruction.
Well,
Uh,
it does, but it kind of feels like, at least from my research, that they kind of wanted Reconstruction to fail, because
mhm,
if the Republicans set up camp and the real change could take place. And so it's this fear that they will lose power that sort of instigates the Klan movement, that
Yeah.
instigates the Daughters of the Confederacy, and how they work together, and very much like Moms for Liberty and the Proud Boys
Yeah.
connection. You see sort of this masterclass in how to keep a group of people oppressed.
Yeah. Yeah, which is so disappointing, especially when you have individuals who most certainly deserve their own movies, like Robert Smalls, who I've advocated for his own movie for years, and I
Yeah.
really hope that that little uh, uh, independent project goes through. Goes
Yeah.
through.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was like so disappointing because that was exactly what was happening. Is that that's where you get people like W. E. Du Bois and Robert Smalls and such begin to be able to actually become senators and representatives and try to
Yes.
change things.
And then
And
you also see
yeah,
the backlash of that, right? Like look at what happened in Wilmington, right?
mhm,
Wilmington finally has a free electorate, and the eastern part of the state has a very large Black population because there was a
mhm,
lot of plantations down there, and they elected free people of color into positions of power, like the sheriff. And basically all the white people in Wilmington was like, we can't have this, and there was
mhm.
basically a riot, and they overthrew an elected government. So if anybody tells you that they can't overthrow an elected government, it has already happened before. It can't
Yeah,
happen again.
yeah,
um,
exactly.
so it's very interesting because in North Carolina we're not taught a whole lot about this period that is so crucial to what's going on today. Like I knew nothing about the Kemp War,
Yeah,
in North Carolina that happens, and it happened like some of the most contested areas were like less than 30 minutes away from where I grew up in like Granville County.
yeah,
That'd be 45 minutes, but it's sad that we don't know this history because it makes North Carolina so more complicated and a lot less cut and dry.
yeah. Well, and that's very similar here in Georgia because, like, for one thing, this is not necessarily lost cause connected, but it is definitely adjacent. You're not, at least until a few years ago, not a lot of Georgians were taught about, say, Andersonville, which was a
Yeah.
brutal Confederate
God, it was awful. Yeah.
POW. Yeah, uh, but not even just that. Like, there are, for example, uh, there's this lake in Forsyth County, Georgia, Lake Lanier,
Mhm.
um, that had a was originally a site to a prosperous Black town named Oscarville during up until the early 1900s. Um, that was they filled with skilled craftsmen. They were like mason workers, carpenters, blacksmiths, engineers, etc. Somewhat like say Black Wall Street, not necessarily is as wealthy, but it was definitely prosperous and wealthy enough.
They were
And
starting to
then
make their own way.
yeah, exactly. They were starting to make their own way, and then a white woman was killed not within the town, but like outside of the boundaries of the town. And
Of course.
despite no evidence pointing to any of the inhabitants of Oscarville killing her, the white inhabitants of the surrounding towns gathered up mobs and would proceeded to hang a bunch of them, lynch a bunch of them if you want to use the term that is often used, and then would drive the rest out. And then later on, a couple of decades later, Lake Lanier was dammed and built on top of the town. So there's an entire ghost
Yeah.
town under Lake Lanier that not a lot of people know about. I only learned about that a few years ago myself, which is
Mhm.
disappointing, you know.
Well,
But yeah, so
I'm
oh,
sorry,
go
I
ahead.
was reading this book,
No.
The Rise of the Klan, and talking about stories that are not heard. And there's this great story that happens in Granville County. The
Yeah.
sheriff is elected, and it is a white man. He's a former Confederate
Mhm.
officer, but when he comes back, he ends up agreeing that the Confederacy was wrong and ends up becoming a Republican and starts
Yeah.
working with the freed slaves in the area, and they help get him elected.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets crazy. I promise. So
Okay.
trust me. So it's an election, and the Democrats are in there. And as sheriff, he's supposed to overwatch it. They're in the courthouse.
Yeah.
He's invited in the back. And this is right when the Klan starts getting up in North Carolina. Yeah. He's invited and he follows him back there, and everybody sees him follow back there. And time goes by, turns into night, and nobody's seen the sheriff. And everybody's like, oh no, he was in the courthouse. I swear I saw him go through the back. And people of color are not allowed in the courthouse right now.
Yeah.
Eventually, the freed people in Granville County climb up into the courthouse, and they look into the storage room, and they see the sheriff. He is strapped to a table.
Oh wow.
And he has been he's had his throat cut. He's been heavily damaged, and they had a bucket or something down there to catch the blood so no one would ever find him. And they had to go in and break in and get his body out. And this is something we're never taught. And it is like horrific scene, you know?
Yeah. Well,
and it happens in broad daylight.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is in the civil rights era, but it's definitely connected. The events that inspired the movie Mississippi Burning, you know, that was a things that happened, you know, definitely as a result of that.
I mean, a lot of North Carolinians don't know that their own backyard was a battlefield after the Civil War.
Yeah, same with Georgia. You know, it's just all over the place, and so and Tennessee.
Absolutely.
My
family may or may not have been involved in that. Let's listen.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite stories from South Carolina, it involves Robert Smalls. It was a conflict between Black Republicans and white Southern Democrats, where Robert Smalls was like trying to get like better rights and such and concessions in his town, and there were African American Republicans. They were protesting and rioting, and he tried to negotiate and with the leader of the white Democrats, the Southern Democrats, and in the region, in the town, and they were like, "No, we're not going to, you know, capitulate." And Robert Smalls reportedly said, "It's like, well, we can burn down your house." You know, so it's like he's like, yeah, we can burn down the town. Like, what do you want me to? Yeah, so
and to bring it back to Appalachia, I mean, talking about this, I mean, when I was joking about my family, what I was referring to was in Appalachia in Eastern Tennessee, there was a huge problem of Union soldiers maybe taking some revenge on Confederate soldiers returning home. Yeah, and that helped with the formation of the Klan too.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. I've heard similar things in near Ellijay, Georgia, which is again toward the South Carolina, Georgia border.
Yeah, I mean it's wild. I was reading this one book, Bushwhackers, and do you know what happened at Shelton Laurel?
No.
Okay, so there was it was considered to be a Union hotspot. And it's towards the end of the war, and the Confederates are desperate to find the guerrillas and stuff hanging out in the mountains. So they took 11 men from that area, Shelton Laurel, and basically charged them all with being Unionists. The youngest one was either 13 or 11. And they were supposed to be sent to be tried. They take them out. They get outside the city, and right in front of all their family and friends, just shoot and kill all of them, including the child.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
And about 5 years later, one of the Union soldiers that was related to the family member apparently saw one of the Confederate soldiers just in town chilling. And he decided that it was time for some revenge, and he just killed him right straight then and there. Yeah. He went to trial and was found not guilty.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
By the people, they're like, nope, no, justifiable homicide.
Yeah. But, you know, all kinds of interesting stories. You know.
Yeah. Sorry, I get excited.
It's okay. No, no, that's why that's why I have people, fellow historians and
Yeah.
archaeologists, on here to talk about stuff like that. Um, so yeah, so like thank you for illuminating how the Lost Cause grew in the South, because I knew a little bit of it from
Yeah.
Reconstruction, but like I didn't know like all of the nitty gritty. Like, of course, I knew about the United Daughters of the Confederacy, but like
Yeah.
how they worked and everything was always not always very clear.
Yeah,
Uh,
it isn't very clear, but the research that Dr. Cox is doing, I mean,
yeah,
it's amazing and it's so intense. And you read, like, once you start seeing how like systemic it really racism and sexism is, like it's insane. Like the American Medical Association was started on some super racist, super sexist principles. And
well,
I
yeah.
really love how she tears that apart and how much of that is the lost cause that we don't know.
Yeah. Well, and there, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, which, uh, to clarify, no, the people were not infected with syphilis by the doctors. They had syphilis prior. What the experiments were is they were lying to,
Yeah.
not all of the people experimented on, but a lot of them were lied to about being given medication to treat it. In this way, they could see the effects.
Yeah.
Uh, so some people
Let it run
were
its
given
course.
yeah, some people were given actual treatment. Again, but you could argue that was essentially controls
Yeah.
in any science experiments. Horrific. I'm not justifying it. I'm just
Of
explaining
course not. It's
what the
disgusting.
logic. Yeah, just explaining to viewers what the logic was. Is like there were controls, and then there were people who were left to die. So and horrific, slowly and horrible. And that is
And
very
now,
much part of and that is very much part of an effect of the lost cause. You
absolutely.
know, yeah.
Absolutely.
So, all right. So now we've done that. Let's move on to to a slightly less serious subject, but it's still serious enough. Uh, Keanu Reeves throwing his hat in with pseudo archaeologist and pseudo historian Grant Hancock, which so many historians and archaeologists have already covered a lot. Um, and there's not really much to say, but it's important to bring up. And it's alarming because Keanu Reeves is an A-list actor, what people consider an A-list actor, and he's a big name, a big
Mhm.
personality, very popular, and so his throwing in his hat with somebody outright lying and pushing racist theory.
That's the
Let me
thing.
rephrase that.
That's the
I've been trying to phase out theory, racist hypotheses um, about uh, how ancient civilizations were built, specifically that
yeah.
people who were Native American, Asian, African, etc., didn't build their own structures. It was some ancient white lost Atlantis civilization. The fact that Keanu Reeves is throwing in his hat with that is going to legitimize it in a lot
Yeah.
of ways to people. Um, so yeah, and I
Yeah.
think that's really what it is. Like, do you have any more to add to that?
I mean, if there wasn't this like big racist
Yeah,
aspect to it, I would be less, I'd be more like, meh, at
yeah,
least he's not exactly known for being the intelligent one in the movies, at least.
no, no,
I could at least pass it off, but it's the whole racist aspect that just feels so gross. And I'm really surprised. And I kind of wonder if he even realizes that it's racist. You know?
probably not.
No,
Probably
I
not.
don't think so.
I think he's drank. He drank the flavor aid. Like he was given a big old cup of flavor aid. Those of you
Mhm.
watching don't have time to explain what I mean. Look it up. It's
Yeah.
a whole nother subject. Uh, it's literally, I guarantee you, if you Google it, you'll find it immediately. There's not you don't even have to go into something accredited like Google search. Just Google it, you will find it immediately. But
Yeah.
anyways, but yeah, he drank it, and well. So here's my hypothesis, and of course you do know this because we've already discussed this at length with other archaeologist friends of
Yeah.
ours.
Yeah.
That either he was offered a big old paycheck, or he legitimately bought into it, or both. But regardless of what it was, he's now part of it, and that's the alarming part. Is he is now adding some degree of legitimacy to a lot of the lowest common denominator,
You know,
who already bought into it.
yeah. I think if somebody like, honestly, I wish we could get like somebody like a journalist or something just to
Yeah,
be like randomly, not aggressively, just be like, did you realize
yeah,
that this is sort of like a racist theory? I think as soon as he would hear that it's a racist
yeah.
hypothesis, that it's founded in racism, him and his PR team will backtrack so damn hard. It'll be
Oh
insane.
yeah. I almost guarantee it. I almost guarantee
Yeah.
that's what would happen.
Yeah.
And the thing is, as I have brought up repeatedly before, Graham Hancock's theories are literally just uh, a later iteration of the mound builder myth
Yeah.
which is a racist, outdated theory from the 1800s that was essentially the same idea that the mounds, like the earthen mounds, like uh, um, Cahokia and Etowah mounds and such. Are you bringing in the? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, exactly. That or Serpent's Mound, like in that picture, were not built
Yeah.
by Native Americans. They were built by some lost, quote unquote, mound builder civilization that was white. Now,
Yeah.
there was some variation to this. Some uh, American politicians believed that it acknowledged that some of the mounds were surely built by Native Americans, but they were the later, the most recent mounds, and that the earlier mounds were built. Like one was like, oh, the earlier mounds were built by first the Hindus, and then the mounds before that were built by this ancient white lost civilization. And the Hindus were probably Aryans from India
Yeah.
specifically, and that's of course still connected to white racist theories because during the 1800s and 1900s, leading into Hitler and also an individual by the name of Baron Unken von Stomberg, the idea that there was a belief that the Aryans civilization of India, or the Indo-Aryans as they are now preferred to call them, or the Indus Valley
Yeah.
civilization, or sort of the Vedic civilization, were white. And
Wait, sorry, when I learned all this stuff, I wanted to ask you, have you ever looked up and like looked at some of the like the journals like describing the
yeah,
different
yeah,
types of Europeans and stuff?
it's
It freaked
weird.
me out.
Yeah,
Like
it's
I looked up
wild.
my grandfather on my mother's side is Azorian, and so I said, let's see what they say about it. And I'm like, what? They're like,
Yeah,
not quite as big as you would expect an African to be, but the skull is significantly smaller. Good for menial labor.
yeah, yeah. It was wild, wild. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And it's
I mean,
those theories that Graham Hancock latched onto. Specifically, one of the American politicians who was a proponent of this, Ignatius Donnelly, who wrote a book claiming that it was Atlantis in the antediluvian world, that built these mounds. Now the earliest archaeological excavation done on Native American mounds was conducted by Thomas Jefferson, and to his credit, he never once claimed that anyone else made the mounds except
yeah,
for Native Americans. However, other people after him who built upon his work, including Abraham Lincoln, uh,
yeah.
believed that Native Americans did not build the mounds, and
Well,
so
a broken
that's
clock's
yeah,
right twice a day.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Graham Hancock is not hashing anything new, and that's what he's just using outdated racist theories from the 1800s, and that's what's so alarming is that one, he already was very popular. Now he's got some degree of legitimacy thanks to an A-list actor
Yeah.
throwing in his hat, and that is the big, uh, you know, and even though I hate the movie, you kind of wish that Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure still existed. It was real, so that he could go back and realize, oh, he's full of shit. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
I personally think that movie is garbage, but whatever. It would be nice if like yeah. So that's the one of the alarming things.
Yeah.
But it's also something that whenever I don't know when season 2 is going to come out. They've said it was going to come out of Ancient Apocalypse, Graham Hancock's documentary series. They've said it was going to come out for a while, but when it does come out, I do plan on debunking it and making fun of it incessantly, because why not? But it's still sad and disappointing. All right, now the last subject I want to bring up is a subject that uh was that that's so disappointing because it's again it's something that's been a problem in the history and archaeology field for a while. Less so in the archaeology field because archaeology is a much more woman dominated field in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
not every way, but more. But recently in the Atlantic, a historian by the name of Arash Azizi published an article, or at least I think he's a historian. I could be wrong.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, I believe he is, but published an article where he stated that public archaeology and public history uh, on places like TikTok, YouTube, podcasts, etc., were a clear and present danger to people, and claiming that they push. And he's not necessarily wrong on this part. They are vehicles of pushing pseudoscience and misinformation, but so are books. I mean, there are plenty of public books published traditionally by people like Graham Hancock that are also pushing
Or
bullshit.
celebrities.
Or
Gwyneth
celebrities. Yeah, Gwyneth Paltrow, exactly. So yeah, Arash Azizi's right on that, but he's, you know, it's one of those things where like you're right, but for the wrong reasons. But
Yeah.
then the most alarming thing, one thing he points out podcasts specifically, which is a little hypocritical, which we'll get into in a second. But one of the other very alarming things that he did is most of the historians and archaeologists he mentioned were women historians and archaeologists in the article.
Yeah.
Um, and this is a problem that has happened for a while that I have seen personally because I worked for a year at the Chief Family Museum in Chatsworth, where the interpretive ranger, my boss, who was also an archaeologist, was a woman. And one of the clear memories I have is we were doing an archaeology day, and it
Yeah.
was me, one of my mentors who was a my archaeologist, and her. And this guy went to her first and asked her about the Maya Blue, which is, if anyone asks you about the Maya Blue in Georgia, that's horseshit. It's a
Yeah.
conspiracy theory pushed by Scott Walters, the guy who got rejected once by the archaeological community with the Kensington runestone and then just can't get over it.
Yeah.
Essentially, I like to use the analogy: he got rejected to the prom once and then made it his entire personality. But
Yeah.
he went to her and asked her about it, and she answered, correctly. It's like, no, that's not really, anything. And she gave all the evidence as to why. And then he ignored her, and then came to me next and asked me, and I gave him the same answer. And then he ignored me and then went to the Maya expert and
Yeah.
asked him. And of course, he gave a much more detailed answer when really it should have stopped at her because she gave the right answer to begin with. You
So
know,
I've actually had this personally happen to me. Because I was diagnosed. I wasn't diagnosed with ADHD until I was 26.
Mhm.
I struggled in school.
Yeah,
So I didn't really get my degree until I was older. And I
yeah,
was in my master's program. And since I was older, I was married. I decided to have a baby, and it
yeah,
came earlier than we thought. I got pregnant quicker, and I
yeah.
had to speak to a history teacher. I was in an anthropology department, and I spoke to all my anthropology teachers. They were super supportive, super sweet, super nice. Yeah, we'll work with you, everything like that. I go to this history professor, and I won't give any more details than that.
Yeah.
Um, and I sit down and say, well, I just want to give you a heads up. My due date is close to the end of the semester. If I deliver early, I might have to take
Yeah.
my exam later or earlier or something like that. And he was like, huh. And he sat down and looked at me and goes, in all my years doing teaching, I've never had to deal with this problem before.
Oh my God.
I'm like, this problem before? He goes, I don't know if I can work with you or not.
You fucking asshole. Yeah.
Title IX says you kind of have to.
Yeah, you got to, yeah.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
it's like yeah.
it was awful. I mean, history is really aggressively male. And
Yeah.
anthropology, I think, is a little more,
Well,
archaeology has been more male dominated, but at
yeah.
least,
Well, and so I think what you're mentioning is also a twofer. I will get into the second part of it
okay.
in a second, but yours that was definitely what we're talking about. Women archaeologists and historians being rejected. For the one thing, like I will give this very, 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 very minor concession that, like, okay, fine, sure, most college kids are like 19, in their early 20s. Fine, maybe you didn't have to. You've never haven't often or haven't encountered somebody, a 19-year-old, 20-year-old saying, hey, me and my husband are having our kid. But that still doesn't make it a problem even then, even if
this
it
was the
was to
graduate
happen.
program
Yeah,
too.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like I said, it was a very, very minor concession that was just
It ended up
if we,
turning out to be
yeah,
like awful. Like I
yeah,
had to be put on
yeah,
like I couldn't travel because I was traveling back and forth from where I was living to
yeah,
Greenville to go there, and like they told me they didn't want me traveling because I was in danger of delivering early, and I
yeah,
had to drop
yeah.
the class because he refused to work with me. He like would do things like
Uh,
send me the essays like early and stuff like that. You need to go.
no, 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 no. I'm just nodding. Sorry.
Uh,
I was just
and
nodding. No.
like not give me enough time on tests, like refuse to set up to see the projects and stuff like that. It was a nightmare. So I just dropped the class. I mean,
Yeah,
my advisor tried to fight it for me, but I was so
yeah.
exhausted it wasn't worth it.
Yeah, and that's understandable. That's understandable. And that happens very often,
Yeah.
Um, like there's a Native American historian uh, on this app who I'm forgetting her name, and I feel so bad for forgetting her name. It's been a while. Uh, but she, well, and I'm not going to mention her name just for anonymity, but she's a historian. She had her master's degree, and one, she's Native. Two, she's a woman, and so she was even told by her advisor that as a Native American woman, she would have to work harder than anybody, and of course she wasn't
She was like,
taken very
really?
quick.
Are you
Yeah.
serious? I have to work harder than everybody?
Well, it was more like it was more from the way she spoke about it. It was more like warning her of what advisors would act like.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, yeah, kind of like the advisors would. Yeah, they would scrutinize her stuff way more
Hmm.
than, yeah,
Hmm.
because yeah, obviously as a native indigenous person, already working harder, but like specifically in this case scenario, she was like pointing out that they were saying that the advisors were not going to take her seriously for both being native and both being the woman.
Yeah.
And and it's something I've seen so many times. And uh it's also connected in a lot of ways. uh well, for one thing, well, before I get into that, a lot of, as we have seen on social media recently, a lot of women archaeologists and historians are at risk of being attacked and
Hmm.
stalked and doxxed and threatened, and forcing them to delete their social media accounts and things like that, which does happen to men, but like to a much lesser degree.
Yeah.
It's far more often to women, and we've seen this happen repeatedly where people, recently, because of this article, had to, private their accounts.
Yeah.
And yeah, exactly, which is disappointing.
Yeah.
Um, and shouldn't happen that way, but it does. And that's what makes Arash Azizi's thing so, yeah,
Yeah.
is, yeah, so like irresponsible, because
I agree.
you're putting women historians and archaeologists at risk. Um,
Yeah.
so, and also hypocritical, because he claimed that podcast historians were terrible and were spreading misinformation, and then he promptly went on a podcast to talk about history, which is just like,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
an asshole. It's like, and I pointed this out to him in a video reply. I was like, so I'm guessing, based off of the fact that you're on this podcast, you only meant women,
Well,
historians.
I think he wants more PhDs on there. I think he wants more
Yeah,
academics, which typically
well,
are male, right?
male, yeah,
And
and have and who have tenure, and tenure, one, for one thing, is already becoming less and less common. But also, because I plan on do plan on eventually getting my PhD, and I've been told by people, oh, the likeliness of you getting tenure, and I'm like, okay, well, tenure has far too often been used as a get out of jail free card
Mhm.
for creepy male professors, So I maybe making it to where it's nearly impossible to fire somebody for doing something wrong is not
This is
such a good
not big.
idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a great thing. But yeah, exactly, and that is I think that's what it is. And a PhD doesn't mean you're. I mean, yes, it means you're in theory an expert in your field, but some people slide through on their PhD. Like I've read PhD dissertations where people got advisors that had nothing to do with their professions. Like
Yeah.
one person who claimed to have a PhD in archaeology, and then they cited a whole bunch of like Mormon sources in Wikipedia articles and things like that. And it's just like, oh my God, no. So
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah, so it's just like, so yes, in a PhD, they're great, but they're not the be all end all. And there are plenty of people who are public historians who have even just bachelor's degrees, like
Yeah.
Mini Minuteman, Milo Thatcher on YouTube. He's great, and he's only got his bachelor's. So yeah, but
I, I think what all of this misses is that I think there is a pressure on universities to have a social media presence,
yeah,
and professors have no desire to do it because they are not going to earn tenure off of social
yeah,
media.
yeah,
And there is misinformation everywhere. And I feel like how we all kind of come to it is we're sitting here on TikTok, looking at whatever, and then we come across something that is just absolutely horrendous. And you're like, wait, no, 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 no. And we all kind of get like pulled
yeah,
that way. And we end up feeling this need because there is
yeah,
so much misinformation out there. And if we can teach people how to critically appraise that stuff in
yeah,
our videos, as well as teaching them history, it could be a very
yeah.
powerful tool against misinformation.
Yeah, and I've wit in historians and archaeologists that we know have brought forward, whose names I'm not going to mention just for their anonymity, but
Mhm.
that brought up people who are academics. They're like, hey, this is important because yeah, sure, it doesn't get us tenure, but we can get our information out there to the public easier and in a much more digestible fashion, which will in the end help our career because we will become more well known and things like that, and our
If that's what
research
they're
gets
going for,
out
but if
there.
they
Yeah,
have tenure, they're
they don't give a shit. Yeah, exactly,
yeah.
exactly. But yeah, and so with that, we're going to go on to the part, the twofer of what you mentioned what happened with your professor. So this
Yeah.
is something that I brought up recently that was actually also connected to Rush Aziz's article. Is
Okay.
unfortunately there is a such an unnecessary rivalry, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, such an unnecessary rivalry between archaeologists and historians.
Yeah.
I have been told, and I know other archaeologists who've been told by historians before that what we do isn't as important or it's not necessary because we're not learning anything new. In fact, there's a very good article on this from 2003, I want to say,
Uh-huh.
from the magazine Archaeology, called Always a Handmaid, Never a Bride.
Yeah.
Handmaid and Never a Bride. And it's talking about specifically historical archaeology and how historical archaeology, you know, uncovers a lot of stuff that's not necessarily talked about in primary documents about,
Yeah.
say, colonial North America, like in Virginia and things like that. But oftentimes it's like, oh, well, we don't need it. You're not telling us anything new that's not in the
Yeah,
documents. Or
that's
yeah,
something my
yeah,
professor one of my
yeah,
professors at East Carolina, Dr. Charles Ewan, I'm
yeah,
gonna say his name because
yeah,
I don't
yeah,
think he'd care about me telling the story.
yeah,
When one
exactly.
of the first things he does when he comes into class is he's like, when people think about historic archaeology, historians
Yeah,
sometimes they're like, oh, here's this beautiful dissertation on everything, George Washington ever wrote. And they feel like they turn over to the archaeologist, and the archaeologist, yeah, and here's his teeth,
yeah,
like that's
yeah.
what we are. But
It's
really, I
not.
mean,
Yeah.
we can actually call into question and help
Mhm.
answer how much of
Yeah.
this stuff is propaganda? Because let's face
Yeah.
facts, history is propaganda.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, it's like I know the site archaeologist in Georgia for Fort Frederica, and sure, we've got a lot of documents about the battles between uh, the British colonists and the Spanish Empire. For example, the most famous battle is the Battle of Bloody Marsh. But like didn't necessarily know where the battles were. So he, as an archaeologist, he looked at all of the known maps of where some of the battles were. And he specifically looked for the battle that took place before Bloody Marsh, and then he went out and performed metal detecting at. He found several of the maps that converged on one specific site. Not all of them agreed on it, but most of them agreed on this one spot. So he went and he metal detected, and he found a whole bunch of musket balls and other evidence of battle in that spot. So he's like, okay, this is where this battle most likely was. And so it's like, based off of where this is, we can trace where the Battle of Bloody Marsh happened. Now, unfortunately, it's now under a whole bunch of shopping centers and other tourist traps because St. Simons, Georgia is a massive tourist destination. So, so he's like, I can't do any archaeological work there, but
it's like, I think we had to read it in Dr. Ewan's class, was the excavation of the Battle of Little Bighorn, and how like they proved that the oral tradition that the natives told is accurate, and the story that is told to the United States is a horseshit. And so exactly, it's nice to be like, they were right, we were wrong.
Well, and not even just that, like untold stories, like the stories of enslaved individuals, or like how in Jamestown, how they proved that, like, oh, they did actually, cannibalism did in fact happen in this spot.
He was likely already dead, though, thankfully.
Well, likely already dead, but it still happened. But unfortunately, places like Colonial Williamsburg and Jamestown and things like that, they use archaeology just more like, oh, look at these cool things they found. Now here's what the documents say, and that's not what it was. And I know an archaeologist, like he told me the story where he was working at he was doing a dig at this historic site, and the site historian was like, told him that, oh, he's one of those historians like, oh, we don't need archaeology because like we already know everything we need to know in the documents. And then he proceeded to find a pre-contact Native American village that on the property that no one knew about. And he said, and his exact words were quote, needless to say, that historian did not work there for much longer.
No, I guarantee you.
But like I have so many, and unfortunately there are also historians who do buy into pseudoscience. There is a
there's archaeologists who buy into some of the crazy stuff.
There is.
Out there.
That's
crazy
fair.
on all sides.
And that's fair, but historians are in my experience, are far more susceptible to that for whatever reason. So are geologists, which is weird. I had a geologist I worked with on a survey try to like argue that that there was some conspiracy in the Middle East because the pseudoscientist couldn't dig where he thought the ark, not the Noah's Ark, but the
Ark of the Covenant.
Ark of the Covenant, thank you.
Yeah.
Was buried. And she's like, well, why are they letting them dig there if it could prove the Bible? And we had to explain to her, like, well, you have to have permits and things like that. And like the project manager was actually on that project, and she explained, she's like, well, yeah, I worked in that region a few times, and like there's a lot of hoops you got to go through to actually dig there, so they probably just didn't do their due diligence to get the permits. But so that happens, and there's this historian, and he does actually have history degrees, but I've since blocked him because he's an idiot. But he's that kid who like talks about like the missing 411 or whatever in state parks or whatever. I don't know.
I've not come across him, and I'm very happy I haven't.
Yeah, but he also has genuine history degrees. He has 2 degrees in history and 2 degrees in religion. But he's also like one of the people who bought into Graham Hancock's theories. Like I actually called him out on that. He talked about like, oh, the flooding, the flooding of the coast and things like that. And I'd explain, it's like, yeah, but that was like centimeter, that was 200 feet over 500 years. That wasn't an immediate flood. It was over the course of 500 years. And of course he never responded, but
the thing is, and I'm about to disillusion you, don't ever marry like a like professional something, because once the veil's been revealed, some doctors are freaking idiots. I'm not gonna
yes, they are. Yes, they are. Yes,
absolutely, like cannot put A B together.
I've worked with some of them on projects. It's interesting.
Yeah,
It's interesting.
my husband has said that he's uncomfortable with how many times he's had to look at, like, when he was going through residency stuff and look at it going, how did you get that MD again?
Yeah.
Because like they
Well,
would say off the wall shit.
well, and then you yourself have also, I remember you did a video of when you were at that a function with your husband, and then these doctors were like, "Oh, you're a Civil War, what's your favorite battlefield?" And that's
Yeah, yeah.
another massive thing that archaeologists and historians are like, "Oh,
Especially as a woman, I
yeah,
think
yeah, especially it's a woman," which is again goes back to
your
the
little
first thing.
thing
Yeah,
got going.
yeah, yeah, exactly. You like it's a massive thing that's like that women one archaeologists are not taken seriously by a lot of times by the quote unquote hard sciences, even
Hmm.
though we technically are a hard science. We use the scientific method and things like
Yeah, we
that,
do.
um, but women archaeologists especially are not taken seriously by the hard sciences or even the humanities, which also again archaeologists are not taken seriously by the humanities for some reason. It's a
I
weird
think it's they're
thing.
jealous. They're
it,
jealous.
it is. It
Cool.
is. Well, it's like we
Cool.
provide a lot of information that isn't in the historical documents. Like,
Yeah.
um, well, here's a prime example, a good example, and one of my favorite examples, proving that the Amazons were based in, to some degree, in fact, because the Scythians and Sarmatians, who were nomadic horsemen and nomadic cultures on the Eurasian steppe, women
Uh-huh.
also went to war and rode horses, and they found using osteology and things like that that
Yeah.
they indeed participated in battle. You know,
That's
um,
awesome. I
so
love stuff.
yeah, so it's like things like that, where it's like that confirmed what Herodotus and other Greek writers are saying. We're like, yeah, he said the Amazons lived in Scythia, and it's like, well, here you go,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's like we provide a lot of important information that is not
And
always backed
information
up.
that they didn't even think to include. I mean, they wouldn't have thought to include some of these things that would just daily
Yeah,
to day lives. Like I wouldn't have thought to include that I drank this day, this, that, the other,
yeah,
and we can sort of
exactly,
help
exactly,
fill out the
yeah,
picture, especially the people
exactly,
who aren't included. And this is why I love archaeology and over
yeah,
history, is because it gives you the chance to tell the story of the average woman, the average person, the average child,
yeah,
not those who they felt were important enough to keep in history.
yeah.
And I feel like archaeology and like the oral history traditions kind of help fill in that gap that has been missing for so long of the average person in the
Yeah,
past.
and to connect that to your state, Roanoke, and the Lost Colony, and the whole
Yeah.
archaeologists have been talking about this for years. Now they used to unfortunately archaeologists for many decades and such ignored Native American oral history, but
Yeah.
for the past 30-40 years they have actually not been, and they have repeatedly, despite the History Channel and other places putting out
Uh-huh.
documentaries claiming otherwise. They've been like, no, we're pretty sure that they went to this island here, and we found a lot of evidence that they've been here with they were here with the Native
Yeah.
Americans,
Yeah.
and people have been ignoring them, and they've been publishing books and everything, and Native Americans have been like, hey, these archaeologists are telling our story, please listen to them, and
Yeah.
they're it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
and
And
that,
is it like it was one of the offshoots that became part of the
yeah.
Lumbee tribe? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Or in Georgia, like there are textual documents of Hernando de Soto and such coming through and talking about his battles. But one like there's actually a paper I found recently talking about archaeologists finding out, looking at like his maps and descriptions of where like regions and Native American nations were, and they narrowed it down using archaeology to where one of these nations was and what region it was, which,
Awesome.
yeah, but like they've looked at like the aftermath of DeSoto's battles with like the Tuscaloosa chiefdom at Mabilla and other Native American nations, and have found like they were reusing, European metal
Yeah.
to make, axes and jewelry and arrowheads and things like that, objects that were left behind,
Yeah. And in
and it's like,
bioarchaeology, I think from DeSoto, they were able to find like how the populations, like how the diseases spread, because
Yeah, yeah.
basically the entire native population of Appalachia is decimated because of him.
Uh, Actually, interesting. There's a paper I found recently that called that into question to a certain degree, not
Oh,
completely.
really? Cool.
So the paper doesn't. So the paper states that they state very clearly they're not arguing that disease eventually came to Appalachia and decimated it, but they're arguing like the time frame of it. And
Oh,
so what they argue is that actually places like Appalachia and even like inland Mississippi and Alabama and Texas and such were actually more insulated from disease. And it actually took longer for smallpox and measles to spread that way. Of course, DeSoto certainly helped it, but they're
yeah,
like
yeah.
the it spread far more quickly along the coast, which makes sense because that's where the earliest colonies were set
Yeah.
up. You
That's where
know,
more people are going to be affected because more people
yeah,
are
yeah,
interacting with each other.
exactly.
This is
They're
why I love
interacting.
archaeology. You
Yeah,
take something that
exactly.
what you thought happened, and then you're like, wait,
Yeah,
we have this new science. Let's apply it.
yeah, yeah. And
Turns out
again,
our
yeah,
theory was incorrect.
yeah. And it's like it will. And again, and that's what a lot of people, historians and archaeologists, have been bringing up, especially native historians. They're like, hey, disease certainly had a factor, but it also like you're not taking into account other things like how brutal the Native American slave trade was and
Yeah.
how many regions were depopulated because Europeans and Native American allies were actively capturing and uprooting Native American peoples and
They were fighting
removing
each other
them.
too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's like it's unfortunate that it's a thing that I've come across so often that it's like archaeologists and our historians are like archaeologists are the black sheep for whatever reason and then
You know where I find
add
that
that
different at?
where
I took a public history course in
yeah yeah
AECU, and public history seems like, whoa, cool. You've got things to
yeah
show us to make history really cool. Please,
Yeah,
come on.
exactly. And
I
that's
love
correct.
that.
Yeah. Public history and public archaeology go hand in hand too. Now, to be fair,
Yeah,
public archaeology in a lot of ways is cultural resource management archaeology, but that's still, part of it,
yeah,
you know. And so, yeah, and that's cool. And I wish it was more often like that. Unfortunately, we have people, well, like us, a group that you work with, the Humanities Guild,
yes,
is a great place to look at. Um, so many professors like I know he won't care if I mention him. Howard Williams, Archaeodeath here on
yeah.
YouTube and also on TikTok. He does public archaeology and things like that. So many people are working to do it, but unfortunately, and Archaeodeath has run into this himself. Howard Williams has run into this himself. So many academics will fight back against it tooth
Yeah.
and nail, and it's
Yeah. It's
asinine.
like
And
competition
Archaeodeath,
over the
yeah,
truth.
yeah. And again, Archaeodymus has pointed this out himself. It's like, so many times women archaeologists and historians will be attacked by other academics, and then, you know, like Howard Williams will come to their defense. I'll come to their defense. Of course, you will come to their defense and things like that. But unfortunately, it happens so often, and it's again part
It's
of this
exhausting.
broader thing.
Yeah.
Archaeologists hated by historians, especially academic historians, and then add woman into that equation, and it's even worse. Woman
Yeah.
archaeologists and woman historians hated by academic historians by a
Yeah.
large degree for whatever reason. I know the reason it's sexism, but it's
Mhm.
the plain and simple. But
Well, they don't. They how is it? So there was a
yeah,
in the 90s and early 2000s, they noticed that archaeology was starting to become more and more female dominated. Apparently,
yeah.
there was a lot of pushback from the older generation
Oh yeah.
saying, we're going to go the way of teachers. People are going to no longer respect us. And I
Oh
think
my
there's still
fucking
that very
god.
much fear in males and like, oh God, if we're
Probably.
taking over, we're going to be like, we're going to go from
Well,
this really respected field to nobody's ever going to respect us again.
and it's just like, well, like my thought about that is like, fuck them. If they don't respect you, then deal with it. It's
I
not a
mean,
big deal. Yeah.
I don't think that's the way it is anymore, especially with our generation and the
Yeah.
generation that are
It's
coming
not. It's not.
after. I mean, you're hanging up on the boomers and maybe some Gen Xers, but most Gen Xers I know could care less.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
You know?
far more often than not, my bosses at archaeology firms are women.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it's like fine, I don't, it doesn't bother me one fucking bit. As long as I get paid, I don't care. Like,
Yeah, we're all doing the same job. We're all here to do it together. As
yeah,
long as we're all ethical, it shouldn't
yeah,
matter.
exactly. And that is what is so dangerous about people like Archaeology, because they make these things and they widen the divide, and it's just so disappointing.
And I wonder how much of it is, this pandering, right, to cause
It has
attention
to be.
because he seems to like there
Well,
seems to be something going on with his academic career. I don't know what. I'm
yeah.
not going to get into
Well,
that.
especially considering
He's
he
trying to
went
get
on to
attention.
a yeah. Well, especially considering he went on to a Joe Rogan esque style, Andrew Tate like podcast. He
Yeah.
seems to be catering to the macho frat boy, dude bro personalities. And I feel like
Maybe he is a dude,
maybe
bro. I don't know.
maybe, yeah,
It's
because
possible.
that's certainly the what how the vibe I got from that article. So
I think him and JD Vance would get along very well.
I agree. I agree. So yeah. So like all these were important topics to talk about because the two most important, what's going on with Appalachia and Appalachian history, or accurate Appalachian history that isn't
Yeah.
bogged down by political bullshit,
Or racism is what the white
or
supremacy
racism,
thing.
or
Yeah.
white supremacy, which is
But you got
also
to
connected
realize
to,
a
yeah,
part of the narrative is a white supremacist. They would hold us up
yeah,
as an example of, oh, they're
yeah,
such the great right ways because they're pure. They can't get off the mountain, so they have to marry their sister.
yeah,
You
yeah.
see, and you actually look at Appalachian history. We've never been like, I'm only going to marry a white woman. I mean, we have
No,
intermingled and mixed. I mean, heck,
yeah. Well, yeah.
it's who we
So,
are.
some I meant to mention earlier, but so many prominent like Cherokee and Muskogee Creek, and Choctaw politicians and such were of partial, European descent.
Yeah,
Major Ridge, James Vann, John Ross, William McIntosh, etc., were all, at least in part, Scottish.
yeah.
They were most certainly Cherokee, but they were, and Native American nations don't really care what degree of blood you
No, that
have.
was
I
a
mean,
European hang up.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. But like they still were like Major Ridge's father was Scottish, James Vann's
yeah.
father was Scottish,
Because
etc.
it turns out the poor don't have that
Yeah,
type of filter on it. Pretty is pretty, beautiful is beautiful.
yeah,
I'm gonna
yeah.
go with what I like.
Yeah, exactly. And so yeah, bringing that nuanced history, and yes, there was racism there. Yes, people did own slaves.
Absolutely,
Yes,
there still
people
is.
did attack and discriminate and commit genocide against Native Americans, but there were also people who fought hard against it. Another prime example of that is is Sam Boyster, who was a missionary in Georgia, in the capital of the Cherokee Nation, New Echota, who actually went to court for the Cherokee Nation in 1835 to contest the Indian Removal Act,
Yeah.
and he won in Worcester v. Georgia, where the Supreme Court stated that while yes, the government couldn't encroach on, couldn't infringe on state laws, that the Cherokee Nation did not apply to Georgia state laws. They applied to federal laws. And so
Yeah.
therefore the Cherokee Nation, could not be removed as per the Indian Removal Act. Of course, Andrew Jackson was like, don't care, do it
Yeah,
anyway.
that's Andrew
And
Jackson. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, which also set a whole lot of precedent for president having way more power than they were intended to, but whatever.
But at least he
That's
wasn't a
a
king yet. He
yeah.
wasn't king yet.
He was called a king, so he was called King Jackson the First. So
Yeah, yeah. He
yeah,
liked to throw his little hissies.
yeah, but there's that nuance there that people I wish would learn, and again, it's also still connected to the lost cause myth, because the lost cause myth is baked into that, and so
Yeah.
much of what people think of Appalachia is in large part because of the lost cause.
Well, like
So
the lost cause really plays itself into it because whenever they need us, they cater to us, they pander to us,
Yeah.
and the Democrats left us, I mean,
Yeah.
alone because they didn't understand what was going on up there. And
Yeah.
you know, I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly it.
Yeah,
It's just
it's
like,
just
like you got to kind of throw your hands up in the air and be like, yeah,
it's so hard because like if we could just get people to talk because Appalachians have big hearts. I know a lot of them, and
yeah,
if they just
yeah,
remember that they're a community,
mhm,
it's what we really need right now.
exactly, exactly, exactly. And so, yeah. And so those are the two most important subjects we wanted to talk about. But also, like we had those other, the Keanu Reeves and his pandering to pseudoscience that needs to be discussed and
Yeah.
called out, and is being discussed and called out. And then, pointing out the dangers, for, the unnecessary dangers that women archaeologists and historians face in the academic community.
We
Uh,
didn't even get into like the Me Too movement that went through archaeology too.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's a whole subject for
Yeah,
another
yeah.
video. Yeah, yeah,
We'll do that later.
wow, yeah, we'll do that later.
We
But
could just say yeah.
and then yeah, exactly. And then connected to the unnecessary danger that women historians and archaeologists face is the broader ostracization of archaeology, of the field of archaeology and archaeologists at the hands of the hard sciences and the humanities, such as academic historians. Not all historians, because public historians don't do that necessarily. I mean, some of them do, but they're the minority.
I feel
But
like the younger ones are far more open to it. It seems like it's the
yeah,
old guard mostly.
yeah, exactly, and that seems to be the pattern. I mean, how many? For example, the only archaeologists who still hold on to Clovis first are the old guard archaeologists,
Yeah.
and even then they're in the minority because most old guard archaeologists were pretty much immediately like, okay, cool, we've got this
Yeah, whatever.
evidence there. Yeah, yeah, exactly. But yeah, so there's that too. But yeah, it's like it's this rivalry that exists that need to be discussed, and this danger that archaeologists face, and especially women archaeologists and historians face. That was a subject that definitely needed to be brought up because all of this comes back into the reason I'm doing the series, and that's public archaeology and public history, is talking about from various different perspectives and experiences, the importance of public history and the various history places, because unfortunately it's becoming more and more important, and we're having to defend it more and more because of people like Rush Zizi and Graham Hancock
And the
and the
potential threat
loss.
if Vance
Yeah,
gets into office and the selling off of federal lands. I mean, we haven't even gone to
yeah,
that nightmare
yeah,
yet.
exactly. Yeah, and the continued threat of the lost cause that just will not go away, despite us trying. But
Yeah.
yeah, so we covered very important subjects in this video. We could go on and on. But the last thing I want to do is ask you, Kelly, what book recommendations do you have based off of this stuff that we talked about?
Ah, actually, I did one earlier.
Yes, you did. Yes, yes.
Uh, like a family, if you're really
Yeah,
interested in North Carolina history, it has to do with Appalachians, but it is kind of a labor union sort of thing.
yeah,
It's done from the they people from UNC went into the mountain region and found the people that lived there and did these interviews and collected them and turned the project into like a family. And it's a really great read if you're into that sort of thing and you like hearing from the perspectives of those who went
yeah,
through it.
yeah,
Excellent.
yeah,
And also one more book.
yeah. That's fine.
Um, this one right here, if you're looking for lost cause
Yeah,
mythology stuff,
yeah,
the NewSouth Creed, a study in Southern mythmaking, fascinating stuff.
yeah,
It really like plays inter with like the white supremacist movement and lost cause and religion and how that all interweaves and it
mhm,
becomes like the lost cause becomes a new religion essentially of
yeah,
the South.
exactly. Yeah,
So it's really
I'd
cool.
also, yeah, I would also recommend. I don't know if you have heard about this book or read it, but there's a very good book that is about slavery within the Civil War called Marching Masters. It has a
I'd
lot of
love to read. Yeah.
it has a lot of primary documents in it.
Cool.
Also in the search for Black Confederates is another one that's like because there's that's another lost cause. Like there were Black Confederates, like another one. So
Yeah. Okay, dude. Right. Uh-huh.
yeah, yeah. So this historian did a book debunk. It was a book entirely meant to debunk the thing called "In the Search of Black Confederates," and he went point by point and looked at all the
Yeah.
evidence, and it's like, no, it doesn't exist. Yeah,
Yeah, going point by point, I appreciate it, but you just have to go as far as what, like,
yeah,
Robert E. Lee said himself. He goes, once
yeah,
you put a gun in the hand
yeah,
of the enslaved, it nullifies everything the Confederacy stands for, and he is
yeah.
100%
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Now I have a few books to recommend, just
right.
five,
Go
but
for it.
they're all connected to this subject. So one is a very good book by William McLoughlin, who's was a historian. He's no longer alive. Um, called Cherokee Renaissance in the New Republic, talking especially about the Cherokee Nation during in Appalachia during the from 1810, like before and after the War of 1812, and in the 1820s, in the
Awesome.
era of good feelings in the Jacksonian era. Also talks about some early Cherokee history. This one is heavily connected to North Carolina. It's called "The Flower Hunter and the People," and it's specifically talking about William Bartram's travels through the American Southeast, where he went through North
Cool.
Carolina and spoke with the Cherokee and things like that. This is a good one. There's a light one shine in it. Carolina in Crisis: Cherokee Colonists and Slaves in the American Southeast by Daniel J. Tartara. Highly recommend this book. It is about the Anglo-Cherokee War in the Carolinas in the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War. This one's also Carolina based, and this is this Torrent of Indians, War on the Southern
I
Frontier.
have that book. I haven't read it yet.
Very good. I highly recommend reading
Okay,
it.
cool.
It's yes, very good. And then this one is I have several books on the Cherokee American War and also the Cherokee participation in the American Revolution, but this is one of the best ones, The Dividing Pass by Tom Hatley, and it really goes into different perspectives and tactics and political reasonings and things like that
Cool.
within the Carolinas and Tennessee. So which all of which provide very important nuance into Appalachian history, especially like the Daniel J. Tartara one, which looks at both Cherokee history and enslaved individuals. You know.
Sorry. I just remembered I have one more. Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead. No, you go ahead. You
All
go
right.
for it.
Speaking of Appalachia, I forgot I had this one. I'm in the process of reading this one. It's a collection of essays. It's reconstructing Appalachia, the Civil War's aftermath. And so far, it's really, really good. It's got a bunch of different essays looking at a bunch of different locations and how
Yeah,
Reconstruction failed.
yeah. Oh yeah, so yeah, exactly. And I will link all of these books in the description, Kelly. If you will, I'm not going to remember the titles of those books,
Yeah, I'll send
unfortunately.
it to you. No problem.
Yeah, please, yeah, yeah. It's like so much stuff like doing. I'll forget it, before I'll remember these because I have them right beside me. So,
Of course,
so,
of course.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But yeah, so yeah, I recommend looking at these books. Kelly recommends looking at her books, which I will probably eventually get those, but it'll be a little while.
Yeah,
But these are all very important sources, and that just is the scratch of the surface. Like you've got
yeah.
so
I
much
could
more that you can
give
dive
you like
into.
50 books easy.
Yeah, yeah, same here. Exactly. So yeah, so with that, we're going to end the video. Thank you, Kelly, for coming on,
Thank you for
talking
having me.
about all of these important public history facts. Of course, you will be on again very soon to do something that we will not talk about yet because it is, going to be more fun based, but
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So, but yeah. All right. Well, thank you for coming on again. Have a good night.
Thanks for having me.
Follow everyone, please. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to Kelly White-Bateman, Historically AHD on YouTube and in TikTok.
And
Uh,
please donate anything you can for the people in Appalachia. The Cajun Navy is helping out, and
Yeah.
Operation Airdrop is also another great option.
Yeah, definitely is. Exactly. Exactly. And then as always, like, share, and subscribe. Remember to like, share, and subscribe my YouTube channel and this video. And if you want to see any of the subjects we mentioned in this video or other subjects we brought up covered in greater detail in later video, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And I hope you all have a good day. And we'll see you next time.